I threw a bunch of donuts in your car. He's like, perfect. That's what we need to know. Let's go do that again right now. So anytime you get a new brand or a new car to sell as a dealership, you learn pretty quick what errors and what issues mechanically they're prone to having. And when we got the Aston Martin franchise, we learned before too long that most of our problems with them were going to revolve around transmissions. And we learned particularly that some of the older cars were exceptionally prone to gearbox failure, and any kind of car that has a sequential manual gearbox is somewhat prone to actuator failure and pump failure and everything else. But Astons, particularly Vanquishes, were particularly prone to this type of failure. That's why you'll see guys like Matt Farah converting theirs to sticks, because by the time you replace the actuator and the F1 pump and a clutch and a throwout bearing, you end up being in the 25 to 35 grand zone, and for about 40 grand you can convert it to a stick. And what happens is, as these kind of time bomb issues start to plague cars like that, I call it the Maserati problem. They start to cause depreciation for the cars because people just aren't really willing to stomach the notion that at any moment this car might cost them 20 or 30% or more of its value for a non-freak accident sort of thing. You know, certainly things happen, motors blow and things like that, but if you don't really think it's going to happen to you, you don't worry about it. If you buy a Vanquish from anyone who's telling you something that's honest by any stretch of the imagination, they're going to let you know that the monster in the closet, the boogeyman of the car, is the shift actuator failure. And so this guy had just had this happen. A customer, he brought in this car, and it was beautiful. It was sort of an iridescent purplish tone, and the Aston paints are gorgeous, and the customer satisfaction from Aston Martin is always exceptionally high. We had more repeat buyers of Aston Martin cars than any other brands we sold, because they had this idea, they got wrapped up in the mystique of the brand, and they felt like James Bond when they drove them. I mean, it was just the perfect product placement and just the greatest brand image you could ever imagine for a sports car manufacturer. But this guy had just spent 30-something thousand bucks getting his car back to running, and he was over it. And he was ready for something new, so we got him a deal on a brand new DBS that we had some rebates on, and Aston margins tended to be pretty wide, so you could really discount them quite a bit and potentially still even make a bit of money. But we ended up giving him, I think, 45 grand as a trade value for an early Vanquish that had just had this shift actuator repair done. And, you know, he was just happy to get out of it and get into something new that was at least a little bit more trustworthy, because the newer DB9s and the DBS used a true ZF 6-speed automatic gearbox, and it was supposedly, you know, pretty bulletproof, but we learned before too long that it was not immune to such types of failures. Fortunately for us, most of the cars we were selling at the time in that vintage were all still under warranty. And so not long after he took his brand new DBS home and he's loving the car, it gives him a strange transmission malfunction where he's just driving it and all these lights come on and it shuts down and it refuses to start for a moment, and then eventually it fires back up and he can drive it. And so he has it flatbedded to us in the roadside assistance policy, and it's coming down from his house in Tennessee because our geographic area was rather large from here in Atlanta. So the car shows up and we can't make it do it again. You know, we can't replicate the issue. It's not storing a code or anything we can reference back, and it wasn't really a common enough issue that we could say, oh, it's doing that thing the way we had with event store gearbox failures not long after that. But well, you just eventually have to tell him, look, we've driven your car around, we've tested everything, we've used all the diagnostics we're capable of, and we can't make it break in the way you're describing, so we've got to send it back to you. Not long after that, it happens to him again and he sends it back, and we go through the same thing. We can't make it fail the way he says it fails again, so we send it back to him. Of course, a few weeks later, same thing happens and he gets it shipped down. And at this point, he's starting to get upset. He's talking about lemon law and other things, and the manufacturer's starting to step in and say, look, we're not going to send you the car back until we can replicate this issue. Because it wasn't like the guy's lying. I mean, he's going through a massive inconvenience to be without his car for a considerable amount of time. So we promised him we're going to get the car to do this. So we start driving it, road testing it, all the different techs, all the different circumstances we could find, trying to replicate the nature of the failure, and it won't do it. So eventually we get to the point where we've put probably hundreds of miles on his car at this point, and we're just passing the car around at night for somebody to drive home and just say, look, drive it in whatever circumstance you can think of, and let's see what we can make it do. But no one could make it fail. So then, the rotation came around and it was my turn to drive the car home. So I get the keys and I take it home, and I had to go and meet somebody on my way home, like at a shopping mall or something like that. And when I got there, I was just sort of thinking like, all right, we've got a gearbox error, but it could be something tangential to the gearbox, a drive shaft differential, an axle issue, something like that. And so maybe we need to put a little bit more stress on that. So I've got this big wide open mall parking lot, and I'm like, what do? I start slinging donuts and sliding the car around and making sure that all the traction control systems are off, all the sport systems are, as aggressive as they could possibly be, and just to see what the car can do. And I'm having a blast, sliding it all over the place. I think it had rained a little bit that day, so it was nice and slippery, but the car doesn't freak out. But the minute I pulled back out onto the main street, it does it. Every light comes on, transmission malfunction, the car shuts off and won't restart for a moment. I turn the flashers on because I'm in the middle of a relatively busy road, and just wait a few minutes, and then finally I get the car to restart. So I text our service manager, I say, hey, I got it to work, I'll tell you everything in the morning. So I go home that night, and the next morning I go into the dealership and I explain, look, I was sliding it around, but that seemed to be what it takes. Perhaps that's what the customer was failing to mention to us that he'd been doing in the car. So our service manager called the national Aston Martin service rep, and he flew in to talk to us. And the next day he comes in, and we knew this guy, he'd come in fairly often for other problematic Astons. He walked into the service manager's office, and they get talking, and they're like, all right, well, I need to talk to the guy who made this happen. And so he says, go see Ed. So a few minutes later, he walks up to my desk and says, I need to know exactly what you did to cause this failure. And I'm a little bit like, I just kind of cornered with it hard and took some turns pretty fast. He's like, no. I need to know exactly what you did. I said, well, I threw a bunch of donuts in your car. He's like, perfect. That's what we need to know. Let's go do that again right now. And so I kind of look at my boss and I'm like, are you sure you want me to do this? He said, absolutely, go do it. Let's make it happen. So we went out and we found a big parking lot, and we just start hooning around in this DBS and sliding all over the place and being, proper James Bond villain chasers, and had a blast, and he was loving it, but obviously it didn't do it until we stopped doing that and went back out under a road where, of course, immediately it throws all the lights. So he was like, perfect, thank you so much. You've made it happen. That's what we needed. So we eventually get it restarted and get it back to the dealership, and the next day, they shipped in every possible part to replace pretty much anything they could think of, because they obviously didn't want to have to buy this car back, and they wanted to get it back to the owner. And by the time we did, I bet we'd put 700 or 800 miles on the car, but he was just thrilled to have his car back, and owned it for a good long while. I think eventually traded it on the new VINwiki, but I'm sure he loved every functional mile the car had.